Talk about heritage is a wave that is moving across ASEAN and Asia in general, and the awareness is growing, but as we know, all the cities are struggling to balance development and heritage and modernization.
In general, I think the ASEAN can be regarded as one of the economic miracles of the world because of the growth. It's very, very fast and very rapid compared to other regions. But the only problem is we are looking into the cultural heritage sector is that tourism is the only important points in most of the government agenda. So tourism development, attracting money from tourism is one big issues in these regions. And it's followed by, of course, the business sectors, by investors, developers, commerce, and also the development of infrastructure. All is linked to tourism development. And the impact of this is actually the commodification of natural and cultural heritage, which is resulted in the loss of authenticity and sometimes damage, irreversible damage, not just to nature but also to culture. This is the main issue. Second issue, although we are quite progressive in terms of making money, prosperity, but our pledge to United Nations 17 SDGs, all countries promise to achieve something by 2030. But most of ASEAN countries are way behind the schedules in terms of poverty, in terms of education, especially also in terms of the cultural developments. So I think this is the some issues that we are generally faced today. And another problems in regards of heritage movements and cultural management, that the heritage preservation advocacy and civil movements among Asian countries are still very weak. So that's why the reason why SEACHA was formed. Among those many organizations, 10 or now we have 8 Asian country members, the NGOs that represent at least the voice from the ground that can bridge the communications with the government, form a kind of alliance so we can work together to help to empower the voices from the ground, but at the same time also to help the government of the ASEAN countries to be able to address what is the most important issues through clinic programs, through workshops, conference, and so on.
It's a challenge really balancing tourism with heritage conservation. Both have conflicting and complementary goals, and it's really how to balance this. And in each country there are very different situations. For example, in Manila, tourism isn't really too much of a priority, in the sense that the construction that is going on around the city of Manila is really more on development of high-rise accommodation, for example, apartments and other buildings, and this is what is causing our heritage to disappear. So there is really a lack of awareness among our developers as to how important it is to preserve the heritage of the city of Manila in order to capitalize it for tourism.
Can I intervene here? Is it a lack of awareness, or is it turning a blind eye, or lack of inclusiveness of people who are affected?
It's actually everything that you said. It's a very complex issue. There is a lack of awareness in the sense that they do not see the value of these heritage structures in the whole economic picture. And we're not talking about preserving these buildings so that we can make them into museums or freeze the land, the streetscape in the area. It's really using these heritage buildings to create vibrant communities that are economically sustainable, in the sense that the heritage will attract new investments into these areas. At the same time, there is also turning a blind eye when it comes to these developers, because they will of course look at where can I make the money fastest.
In order to understand the value of historic buildings in an urban setting, we need to understand it from an environmental, social, and also planning perspective. Heritage buildings have enormous social, historical, cultural values. They tell stories, they support social memory and sense of belonging. They are important to strengthen urban identity and national identity. They also create attractive focal points in the city. So, just like an urban park increases property values around it, so do historic buildings. Just as you wouldn't redevelop Central Park in New York City or inner city Paris, neither would you scrape away historic buildings anywhere in the world just to replace them with high-rises. There is a place for historic buildings, and there is a place for high-rises. But putting high-rises in the middle of, a row of historic buildings, low-rise historic buildings, is just haphazard development. Old streets are often narrow, much better suited to walking, cycling, public transport, and slower traffic flows. They're not suitable for, high-rises with many floors of car parking, which draw a lot of car traffic into the city. A historic building represents embodied carbon, which means it is the low-carbon strategy to conserve. It can be restored for a home, refurbished into a cafe or restaurant, or retrofitted for a modern office or gallery or any other purpose.
I think it's a very important one in these days where sustainability is being thrown around, as you said, as a buzzword. And the nature of buzzwords is that they tend to obfuscate rather than enlighten as to the content of what is entailed when you invoke these terms. And it is also, a worrying trend where the term sustainability has been co-opted by interests that are hell-bent on continuing the unsustainable practices that sustainability is meant to avoid and move away from in an effort to greenwash the continuation of those activities. So I'd like to maybe start by suggesting, in answer to your question, a much more simple and down-to-earth way of thinking about sustainability, which is simply long-term thinking and planning, whereby we need to think not just about the viability of the long-term viability of the path we are on, of the decisions and choices we make today, but also the desirability of the endpoint of where those decisions and choices are taking us. So what sustainability is asking of us is to really be precise, articulate about what is the future that we want to move towards. And that is the element of choice is I've mentioned, but what that means on a societal level is that there needs to be a societal conversation about what is that desirable future that we want to be striving towards. And that is a conversation that not only needs to be informed by, but will importantly be enriched by cultural heritage, bringing that in. And indeed, I'll go further in stating that culture is the medium through which we have that conversation. And maybe if I could pick apart that term, unpack that term culture, because that I think is important to understanding the relevance of sustainability to cultural heritage preservation. Again, it's a term that is so broad as to sometimes be unhelpful. And the simple way I think about culture is I'm borrowing from my good friend Wanjira Matai, is she describes it as how we do things here. The way I see it, cultural heritage preservation is not so much about a process of pickling something, preserving something in its pristine anachronistic state, despite its relevance, regardless of relevance to today. It really is a living, evolving story that connects who we are today, how we see ourselves, the choices we make today with our past, but driven towards a future that we need to collectively envision.
So I'm very happy to know that now more and more our architect is more having self-confidence to bring up our own uniqueness in the traditional architecture, and this is really based on our own cultural heritage themselves, because our ancestors already also prepare like what kind of the design of buildings. It's typically good for the area that we are living. Like for instance, for the tropical culture, and then also we learn a lot from the natural disaster. So then we come also to the era, the architects now is more open to design for the resistant, for the earthquake, for instance, and also the philosophy of how we are living in the tropical countries should be. The design is not like in the western part, for instance. So this is I see now more and more the younger generation of the architects is stronger, having self-confidence about bringing up how we reinventing our traditional architecture.
So we can look at the future with some optimism.
I think it's in the modern city, more and more architects is try to integrate the philosophy, the intangible culture in the design, in the modern design. So this is in line in what Professor Widodo mentioned about the sustainability of the cities. It's really based on this design.
Yes.
We are looking into the opportunity, because not all are bad. There are some good things. The good thing is there's a lot of young people, young organizations in smaller towns in Southeast Asia, in Laos, Cambodia, even Indonesia, who start to use social media to become influencers in terms of culture. They organize activities that is quite popular, like cycling, but at the same time, not just cycling every morning, but they are also doing a cultural mapping. And this cultural mapping can be translated into heritage management input for the local governments. And we are supporting this kind of ground-up initiatives, especially from the youth.
I think it's undeniable that resources are needed to value cultural and protect cultural heritage, but and that is the experience that we've seen across the world, right? In countries like Japan, France, Italy have invested enormous amounts into cultural heritage preservation with stunning results. And that is something that is, I think it's a clear-cut takeaway. There's no getting around the fact that if we care about cultural heritage, we need resources invested in its preservation and protection. But I would not infer from that, I think it is a wrong inference to say that, therefore, cities, countries around the world should worry about growing first and then paying for cultural heritage later. Particularly, well, for two reasons, actually. One reason being that cultural heritage is inseparable from the development journey. And if you, there is actually a premium, I would say there's a premium on early action to preserve cultural heritage, because the economic development is actually, the pattern that we have seen in history is that it has been at odds and bringing great pressure to bear on cultural heritage assets around the world. So if you don't prioritize it early on, there will be little of it to preserve, because a lot of it will have been lost through the vagaries of economic development. And so I think that is a false dichotomy of sequencing. The two need to go in tandem, and it's a matter of prioritization, of political will, as has been mentioned, and investment. But I also think that so they're very good examples of countries and cities in the developing world who have done a very good job of cultural heritage preservation by prioritizing it. And Bhutan is one very good example of that. And Japan didn't wait to get rich to focus on preserving its cultural heritage sites and practices. It has been very much part of its development journey and what it brings to the world also.
Okay, I think there are three things, and it's continuing with the points that Leo is just bringing out, and also Ari about architecture. One of the characteristics in Singapore is a can-do spirit, walk the talk. When we're talking about sustainability, then it's directly translated into carbon neutrality. So the government is really very bold into this, that we want to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 through Singapore Green Plan, for example, on different sectors. And in terms of buildings, the net zero energy buildings is become mandatory now. And one of the examples is my own office, the School of Design and Environment at National University of Singapore is the first net zero energy building. But this is not a rocket science. It's not a smart technology. It's a commonsensical vernacular architecture. So the design itself is based on the stilt house, tropical, vernacular, traditional architecture, but it's translated into the modern language. And in reality, it's able to achieve not just net zero energy achievement, but also energy positive. And the positive energy is translated into a cheaper energy usage and so on. And second, of course, is that conservation in Singapore is understood not as nostalgia, but conservation is about carbon neutrality, that carbon also have value, and translated into incentives. And the incentives can be related to the carbon trading, and also about the possibility to give more GFA, more floor areas, more volumes to the buildings by not demolishing the old one. And this has happened in different cases like Golden Mile Complex and also large industrial buildings. So I think this pragmatism and walk the talk is something that is quite important, not just about theory and policy, but let the industry, the ecosystem, the entire ecosystem, do something, start the change. And then second thing from Singapore, I think, is the freedom of expressions, the growing activities and influences of advocacy groups. So in the past, we don't have many so-called grown-up movement. Singapore is known as a very top-down country. But since maybe 1 decade ago and even recently, we have e-commerce Singapore, we have the Nature Society of Singapore, we have Singapore Heritage Society, we have even Docomomo Singapore, and much more diverse grown-up movements that is supported by government. So I think the most important learning point here, we need a listening government.
There's really no long-term vision for the city of Manila, and it has to do with the current political system, wherein our mayors are elected every 3 years, and every 9 years there is a new mayor that comes in, and each mayor will have their own plans. They do not follow the plans of the previous administration because they want their own vision, they want their own thing, and that becomes a problem. There is really no long-term vision in Manila and in many cities around the Philippines because of that political environment, as well as the way that politicians respond to these investments in condominiums and high-rise.
Beyond this political issue, I mean, the idea for having the new capital of Indonesia in the area that still also having the majority is a forest is also the good thing. When the government also providing the idea, it can become a forest city. So this means that it will be integrate the nature into the modern city. And it's not only talk about the section of the energy, a section of other resources, but also talking about the culture. Because all the tribes, the root there is like the people, the Dayak people in Kalimantan is also accommodated by the governments to see how is the philosophy of the design of the city.
There are three dimensions that come to mind in terms of unlocking the potential of cities to drive cultural heritage cultural heritage preservation as part of a vision of urban transformation towards a more sustainable, inclusive future. And firstly is to regenerate cities through cultural heritage. Second, promote adaptive reuse of cultural heritage buildings and sites. And thirdly, to balance access to cultural heritage with sustainable tourism and sustainable management of natural resources. And all three of these, I think, very relevant to Bangkok and the possibilities for Bangkok. And maybe I'll just mention a couple of examples to make this a bit more concrete, because I realize it's a little bit abstract. So, regenerating cities through cultural heritage, a lot of that is just about how do you bring back what the cultural heritage of cities in a way that promotes walkability, livability in cities, for example. How do you use cultural heritage as the vehicle through which you shift from vehicle-centric, car-centric to people-centric development? And there's some very good examples of that happening, including through work that my organization has been doing in Istanbul, in the historic peninsula, where we help pedestrianize 300 streets in partnership with Gale architects, and we worked with local authorities and businesses and communities to pedestrianize 300 streets, which today have a traffic of about 2.5 million people every day walking through streets that previously were unwalkable or only so at your own risk. And today is the thriving thoroughfares for economic activity, cultural activity. And we did something similar in New Delhi with Chandni Chowk, which is a historic thoroughfare from the marketplace from the Mughal era. And it became completely clogged with traffic and was choking under the weight of the pressure of cars. And this makes me think. I've had some cholesterol issues recently in my health check, and I think cities are the same, right? The cars is like congestion is like a form of cholesterol buildup, and if we want cities to live, to thrive, and people to thrive within them, we really need to think about mobility and making that enjoyable and pleasant and safe. Traffic deaths have reduced 60% in the historic center of Istanbul as a result of the pedestrianization, right? So that's a very concrete example of, and think about how we can do that in Bangkok's old center, right? In the Chinatown. Wouldn't that be amazing? Isn't that a desirable future to strive toward?